Hello and welcome to Frontline Conversations. This is your host, Amit Baruah. Operation Sindoor analyses are going on. The events from May 7th to May 10th have engaged a host of analysts, Indian, Pakistani, and international, looking at exactly what happened. One of the key issues that Operation Sindoor raised were the loss of Indian aircraft during the 4 days of hostilities. Now, for the first time, uh, the the chief of defense staff of the Indian Armed Forces, General Anil Chauhan, during two interviews in Singapore, one with Reuters and the other with Bloomberg, admitted there were losses of Indian aircraft, but he didn't say how many. According to General Chauhan, the key thing was that India learned its lessons, and on the 10th, it came back, with full firepower. Now, this issue has really engaged analysts. What does it mean? There's a lot of propaganda around it, people claiming victory. Perhaps this downing of the Indian aircraft gave Pakistan the ammunition it needed to declare victory. Anyway, to understand all this, what does it exactly mean? I'm delighted that we have with us Ajai Shukla, a former colonel in the Indian Army, a defense analyst. He runs his own blog and was earlier an anchor, a national news anchor, and war correspondent with NDTV. Welcome to Frontline Conversations, Ajay.
Thank you, Amit. A pleasure to be here talking to you.
So, Ajay, what do you make of General Chauhan's comments in Singapore relating to the loss of Indian aircraft?
On the face of it, it would appear that after having remained largely silent in the eyes of the international press for all those days between the 10th of March, the 10th of May, and now, uh, General Chauhan appears to have decided that it is time to make more of a statement to put forward the Indian military's sort of viewpoint about why it did this operation, how it did it, and the level of casualties, which was becoming into a big issue. Was not having not having given out the number of casualties, both of aircraft and of pilots, the Indian military was coming under a serious amount of pressure. So General Chauhan also appears to have decided to take this opportunity of being in Singapore in front of the international press and explain exactly what happened, why it happened, and very importantly, for the first time, to convey an impression of being front and honest and sort of letting the international media know that we are here to answer all of their questions and we have the answers. So that's, I think, what was General Chauhan's primary motivation.
And what is your sense? Had this been done earlier, do you think some of the propaganda advantage that accrued to Pakistan wouldn't have happened?
That's exactly the case. This is the same thing that happened on a number of earlier occasions, including the Balakot attacks and strikes. The Indian establishment is by nature inherently conservative, and they don't like talking to the press. They don't want to be seen as too eager to get their message out. And the net result and upshot of all of this turns out to be that the other side has given their version of the story, usually false. And the Indian side is left with its own story and its impression of forthrightness. But this time, I'm glad to see that they've come out sort of giving all the explanations that were required. And so, from that point of view, it's a recognition of the power of the media.
And what is your sense? I mean, you referred to this shyness, this reluctance to come before the media. Before we go on to the military aspects of this whole thing, clearly the propaganda war is as important today as what is being fought, in the fields, in a sense. So, what is your sense? Why is there such a reluctance on the part of the Indian establishment to speak out? After all, they have, and interestingly, Ajay, General Chauhan spoke a day after the chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee of Pakistan has spoken, and his story was on the front page of Indian newspapers. It is only the day after that General Chauhan spoke. So why this reluctance, to speak?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me reinforce the point you made, which is that there's this reluctance to speak, which results in the other side's message going out faster, better, and more punchy than our own message. Uh, it is, the causes are deeply historical. The military, prior to 1947, when we were sort of under the British rule, the military was an instrument of colonial oppression. The military was usually acting against the interests of the common man, and in favor of the British rule. And to that extent, you didn't want any such message coming out from the military. The military was used for sort of putting things in their place, making sure that nobody stepped out of line. And that was it. There was no question of trying to portray a benign image or anything of that kind. The military just was there to do a job, to enforce a certain law and order onto the people. And that's what it did. Unfortunately, after 1947, when it should have completely changed and worked on its image to make it appear more like a people's military, a military of the independent interests of India, and a military that holds Indian interests, it continued to be slightly apologetic about its role, and for some reason or the other, from 1947 till now, it has been a sort of a very slow opening up, I would say, of the military. So, what the good news is, and we must acknowledge that, is that over the last 5 years or a decade, the military has become more forthright. It's become more confident about voicing its concerns, and it's become a military that recognizes that the story cannot always be good. There are drawbacks, there are debacles that take place, and if you acknowledge them and address them, it's probably better than just trying to pretend that they never happened.
Remaining with what was said in Singapore, General Chauhan believes that there was a lot of space, between the conventional and the nuclear threshold. He made this point during his interviews. On the other hand, Shamsher Sahib Mirza, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee of Pakistan, believes that Operation Sindoor, one of its impacts was that the nuclear threshold has been lowered. So, how do you sort of balance these two contentions, and how do you view it yourself?
Well, it's easily explained when you look at it in the context of uh, uh, whose sort of interests are being served by letting the sort of the public in general, the newspaper readers, and so on, uh, in sort of trying to explain to them that the Pakistani viewpoint has always been that we must explain that if India, which is the more powerful country, the country with the bigger army, the country with sort of more or less status quoist, if India were allowed to be to have its way with Pakistan, whether in the course of a war or in the course of an operation that goes on, it would make Pakistan sort of look weak. It would make Pakistan sort of become apparent that it was not the stronger power, and therefore it would be better not to sort of lower the nuclear threshold, but to have this nuclear threat hanging in the background as if ready to use. The Indian side, on the other thing, does not want Pakistan to gain too much comfort from its nuclear deterrent, from the 50 or 100 or so bombs that they have. India would like much better for Pakistan to say that this is the Indian interests have to be accommodated, for the simple reason that they are nuclear bombs and weapons that we have are not enough to deter India. So the Pakistan view of the nuclear deterrent and the Indian view of the nuclear deterrent are inherently in conflict with one another. And that is what came out loud and clear during this particular operation. When General Shah Mirza says that the nuclear threshold has been lowered, what he's really saying, without saying it in those words, is that India has now got the space to act, the strategic space to act against Pakistan, and Pakistan will not be so quick to invoke the nuclear deterrent. Pakistan, on the other hand, is giving the message that the nuclear threshold has been lowered. Now it has become a more dangerous place in general. He's talking about South Asia. And therefore, it is not a positive development. It is a development that supports and lends itself to the use of nuclear power.
Right. Ajay, now I want to come to, the events of May 7th to May 10th and how you look at it. There were, 9 sites which the Indian military struck, including camps of training or, centers which were used by terrorist groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. Now, apart from that, I mean, how would you assess our our strikes at 9 sites, the Pakistani response, and then obviously the Indian response? How would you assess these 4 days of fighting?
I would, and I regret as an Indian to have to say it, I would assess the Indian response and the Indian use of force as slightly more ham handed and clumsy than the skill with which the Pakistanis did it. Uh, this is not to say that Indian interests were not served or Pakistani interests were served better. This is more to say that the use of the weaponry, the sort of implements of force that were actually brought into bear over here was to the sort of advantage of Pakistan. Now, why do I say this? Uh, First of all, it was, apparent that India, after having said such a lot in the public domain about the use of force and about its sort of readiness to act if there were any more nuclear, I beg your pardon, terrorist provocations from the Pakistan side, when it actually came to making this sort of apparent, it turned out that India was not really ready. The attack that took place at Pahalgam uh, was followed by several days of sort of apparent sort of inaction by the Indian side, and it was as if nothing had been decided or changed in the way of policy after Pulwama, which was a good 5 years ago. So, to that extent, the Indian side conveyed the impression that what it said it would do after Pulwama was not what it was in a position to do when Pahalgam took place. So, to that extent, the message that went out from the inaction on both sides was a message that was to the detriment of the Indian threat, that it would act immediately. Now, again, they have come out with a 3 point formula for sort of taking immediate action, not being deterred by the nuclear sort of threat, and sort of being acting immediately. But whether this is going to be acted upon will be seen in the days ahead. But it wasn't, as it turns out, in the last 5 years after Pulwama.
Ajay, yeah, just to, uh, apart from the loss of Indian aircraft, what the Indian side was able to show that on in Pakistani air bases, they were able to inflict significant damage. And that has been borne out by commercial satellite imagery as well. But the Pakistanis, for all their claims, including taking out an S-400 system in Adampur, they have not been able to present this kind of imagery. How would you assess that?
Well, I would agree with you partly. I would say that the Indian side has certainly presented better proof than it ever has before of successful airstrikes and missile strikes on important bases in Pakistan, like Rahim Yar Khan and Rawalpindi and so on. So, to that extent, we have not come before the press empty handed. The Indian side has actually managed to present some proofs. The problem is that it took a lot of time in presenting those proofs. It allowed the international media, as it were, and uh, analysts who were purveying a anti India viewpoint to actually sort of fill in that space and come up with their own versions of what might have happened. So, to that extent, the Indian side would have done much better uh, to have acted faster and more nimbly in presenting its proof. But the area in which the Indian side did not do well, and here again is thought for sort of how it best it can be improved for the future, is in the presentation of what exactly happened in the air-to-air combat duels that took place between Pakistani fighters and Indian fighters. General Chauhan admitted in Singapore that Indian fighters had undertaken a significant amount of casualties. The Indian side was not able to provide a counter to that, or to show any concrete proof of Pakistani planes having been shot down. So, to that extent, I'd say the outcome as we assess it was a mixed bag, with India being able to strike Pakistani ground targets but not get so much success against Pakistani fighter aircraft.
And Ajay, for the first time, we've seen, drones going across the international border and the line of control. Indian drones going across, Pakistani drones coming in. This is new. For instance, during 1999, during the Kargil War, we didn't see use of drones like we're seeing now. So, is this reflective of how India and Pakistan are going to fight their wars from now? Will it be drones? Will it be surface to surface missiles, air to surface missiles, air to air missiles, backed up, of course, by our respective air forces?
Well, I would be more conservative about predicting the sort of taking over of the battlefield by drones, and that the end of conventional war as we knew it. I would not go so far as to endorse those predictions. But what is without doubt is that drones and surveillance, enhanced surveillance means, uh, will certainly play a far larger role in the battlefield of the future than it has so far. The sort of swarm value of the drones and the sort of pressure that they can bring to bear on target sort of acquisition means of the enemy, which is to say, in simple terms, that the by simply flooding the battlefield with a large number of these drones and similar weapon systems, you sort of confuse the enemy's detection means and surveillance means and force him to sort of get on the back foot, as it were. So that is absolutely a certainty now, the changing nature of the battlefield, as it were. It began changing in the Azerbaijan war. It was evident once again in the Ukraine-Russia war. And now again, we are seeing it in the Indian context, albeit that the use of drones over here was not as completely earth-shakingly effective as it was in places like Ukraine. Uh, One reason for that possibly could be that India and Pakistan have both got very capable militaries with the sort of a very high degree and a very added number of anti-drone capabilities that can be brought to bear. So it would always be the case that they would be less effective in heavily defended terrain like India and Pakistan. But even so, it was a reminder and a wake up call for the Indian side to sort of build up its drone forces and capabilities, to build up its surveillance capabilities and radars and missiles, failing which one could be sort of forced to take casualties that otherwise would not have been sort of a reality.
You mentioned Ukraine. I just want to digress and ask you a question about Ukraine. We've seen these drone strikes on Russian air bases, on their strategic bomber force. Quite, from whatever I read, it seems to have been quite spectacular. So, would you say that drones today, the kind of role they played, if the Ukrainian claims are to be believed, they were smuggled across and they were located and they were used to hit I don't know, 40, 50 aircraft or strategic bombers of the Russian Air Force. I mean, how would you sort of assess that? Of course, in the Ukraine, ground forces are also at it. It's about, holding and capturing territory. So, are there any lessons for us from what is happening between Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, Amit, there are certainly lessons for us to learn yeah, about several things. And in the context of this drones sort of usage that you mentioned, there are two aspects to it. One is the aspect of the capabilities and the firepower and the accuracy and the strike power of the drone itself and the weapons that it carries. And the second capability, which has to be there at the same time in a linked manner, is the weakness of the defensive sort of elements and systems that are being attacked by the drone forces. If you have a very well defended and a very good surveillance mechanism and so on the drone side, that will sort of automatically take up the number of strikes that they will get and therefore the benefits of that. But if at the same time you have S-400 missiles and you have a very strong surveillance network on the defensive side, the sort of the outcome and the gains that would be made by those drone attacks would be correspondingly less. So India has to work on both tracks, both on developing the drone warfare capabilities and on developing the defensive capabilities. I'm glad to note that a lot of new Indian uh, companies which have only entered the field of defense and of drone warfare in particular in the last 5 to 7 years are making very good headway. And India is going to have a certain sort of world class capability in this particular field itself. So we'll just have to wait and see how good it is, how fast it is, and when it can come into play. And that is going to shape the future and the outcomes on the next sort of decades battlefields.
Ajay, I just also want to now return to, India, Pakistan, what the future portends, what are the threats that exist. And one of the things, clearly, the strikes of May 7th were an attempt by India to send a message to Pakistan that we are going to raise the costs for you if terrorist groups from your territory come across and do this. However, we also know there had been terrorist strikes and terrorist attacks before the incident of Pahalgam. We also know that, from whatever information we have, that the terrorists responsible for the strikes or the killing of innocents in Pahalgam have not been apprehended. The possibility, therefore, of another terrorist attack happening is very much there. And our government has promised that there will be a kind of an automatic response. And we saw in 2019 in Balakot, one site was hit. Now 9 sites have been hit. So if this strike happens again, do you think that the threshold is going to be raised suddenly?
The threshold is there are two sort of aspects to it. One is the stated threshold, and one is the demonstrated threshold. You can make any amount of promises of dire consequences that will take place if one more terrorist strike takes place or such a sort of grievously wounding terrorist strike takes place, that it has to provoke India into a response of this kind. So that particular part is something which, as I mentioned a little while back, something that India is working on, something that is being guided at the highest levels of the DRDO, and something that we sort of really do expect good results on this, for the simple reason that it plays into India's strengths of proficiency in software, reasonable proficiency in hardware, and the command and control centers that are needed for sort of marshalling these drone assets into a sort of a capable force. But again, they say the proof is of the pudding is in the eating, and hopefully it should not have to come to a pass where India is forced to demonstrate the full weight of its capabilities in order to deter Pakistan, because that will take everything up to a threshold which could be unacceptably high. But the promises are there, the capabilities are there, so there's every reason to believe that the outcomes will be there also.
Right. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, Ajay, is one is of course the Indian threshold, one is the Pakistani threshold, and these thresholds can be quite dynamic, and it's up to you to assess them. But the other thing is the threshold of the international community, especially the United States, and we saw after 4 days the United States, after sort of taking a hands-off attitude, if you go by what Vice President Vance said initially, and then the change that happened and the telephone calls that went between different capitals. So, what is the threshold in your view of the international community and the United States? Because clearly they are worried about the fact that these are these two nuclear powers and they have all these weapons and there could be a catastrophe at any time. That's the kind of projection. And maybe Trump has spoken 10 times in the last 15 days about the great success that he's achieved between India and Pakistan.
Well, leaving Trump's claims aside for a moment, what is certainly the case is the point you made, very valid one, about the overall threshold and the concern that it causes on countries that are basically sort of protected by other people's nuclear thresholds. For example, the NATO countries, South Korea or Japan. Between those countries and the countries that are making do with developing their own nuclear threshold, which means India, Pakistan, Israel, and so on. Now, it's easy for those who are already getting nuclear cover from others to sort of take a moralizing and a sort of moralistic stance against countries that have chosen to walk that path alone. And this is a debate that is going to go on. And the accusations of double dealing, not double dealing, I should not use that phrase, of sort of double standards in assessing the capability of nuclear weapons that a country has. For example, who is there who is qualified to talk to India and make demands of India for nuclear sort of probity and sort of carefulness? India is fighting a two-front war on its sort of northern and western borders. It is left to India itself to make the resources available, to make the capabilities available, and so on. Who is anybody else to take up those issues with India and adopt a moralizing stance? India is not going to stand for it. Neither would Pakistan or Israel or any of the other countries. So it's a very sort of polarized and divided debate. And there certainly isn't an excuse in sight.
But it took 4 days. I mean, on the fourth day, whatever the sequence of events, who blinked first, who called first, I'm not getting into it because there are always Indian versions of the truths and Pakistani versions of the truth. But the fact is that on the fourth day, the political military leaderships of India and Pakistan agreed to a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities after the Americans got into the picture. So I'm saying that next time something like this happens, we have to factor in how the Americans will respond and how quickly they will respond to anything that we might do.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. The sort of framework in which this crisis has taken place, which is nuclear power on nuclear power. India and Pakistan, two of the most, and also strong conventional power against strong conventional power. Both these two capabilities have been sort of flashed and rattled, and General Shamshad Mirza's statements come right into the center of this, that the nuclear threshold has been lowered and so on. All of this is calculated to bring in other countries from outside the world and to take a hold. But that in itself is not wholly a bad thing. If India is pulled by the United States and guaranteed that the United States will, as it has happened in this case with Pakistan, negotiate a truce, and India will not need to really think about the nuclear threshold as Pakistan will not either, then it's something to be welcomed as one of the off ramps of the current nuclear.
There's a new expression, the off ramp. I mean, that's
the off ramps is something that was left totally to the most erudite academics in earlier days. But here we have an off ramp requirement right here.
So, Ajay, before I let you go, your former army officer's hat, your analyst hat, your journalist hat, wearing all your hats. What does the future tell us? What is likely to happen between India and Pakistan now? Because that's obviously an area of concern.
My own assessment is that both sides, India and Pakistan, have internalized a couple of things as an outcome of this particular crisis. First of all, Pakistan is definitely internalized that there is no more protected utilization of terror groups and jihadi tanzeems and so on. Not in Kashmir, not across the border with India. This is going to evoke a response from the Indians, and that response, as we saw on this particular instance, is going to be progressively higher, progressively more damaging, and progressively more difficult to explain from the Pakistani viewpoint. So that is one thing which Pakistan can take for granted. The Indian side also is going to, and I understand it already has begun the process of evaluating why such a small, and this is, don't get me wrong, I'm using small only in the sort of international provocation sort of framework. Incident of this nature by the terrorist groups has effectively brought in three superpowers and sort of the two main protagonists themselves into a huddle on the conference table where they have worked out a solution for the problem. So it's basically the costs are too high, the circumstances and the outcomes are too dangerous, and so as you brought out yourself, the sort of the catalysts and the things that bring these crises into operations have to be controlled and kept in check.
Well, those are wise words from Ajai Shukla, a veteran journalist, commentator, analyst, former Indian Army officer. Thank you, Ajay, for speaking to Frontline Conversations, because these issues
Pleasure.
are very serious.
See this and sort of understand that we have actually sailed very close to the wind in this particular confrontation, and there is good cause to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
Well, those are words to be listened to. Thank you, Ajay, again for joining us in Frontline Conversations. We do hope to be able to talk to you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you.